Before I start my presentation, just a quick plug. If anybody has a free afternoon tomorrow, just to follow up on what we've just heard about the Irish nurses, we're actually showing a film about our research with Irish nurses who went over to England to work in the NHS, and that's being shown at the Epic Museum. Sorry for mentioning the competition. At the Epic Museum tomorrow, if anybody is around and is interested, it's on the Epic website. So without further ado, I'll now start my presentation. So my presentation follows on very clearly from what Paul was saying just a moment ago. I just want to show this picture. This is Queen Tailté, in case you may not have seen her before, with the compulsory Irish wolfhound at the opening of the Tailteann Games. And this is actually the cover of my first book from 2002. And yes, I really was old enough to write a book in 2002, though only just barely a teenager at the time. And this book was on gender identity in the Irish press, 1922 to 37. And at the time, I'd never really heard that much about the Tailteann Games, but I was researching Irish newspapers and the nation-building project, and I came across these images of Queen Tailté, and it really stuck with me. So it's so appropriate to be here today, 22 years later, again talking about the Tailteann Games. So what I want to do in my presentation this morning is to draw on newspaper reports, particularly looking at newspapers, Irish, national and provincial papers from the 20s and 30s. And what I want to focus in on in particular is the gendered imagery surrounding the revival of the Games in 24, 28 and 32. I want to explore the contradictions, which were things that Paul touched on there, between the Celtic pagan iconography and the Gaelicization and Catholicism of the newly established Irish Free State. And in doing that, I want to really look at the figure of Queen Tailté herself and the various myths and symbols that surround her. So as we all know, so I'm not going to labour the point, but in defining the nation in a post-partition, post-independent nation-building project, as Paul has also mentioned, a key emphasis was to distinguish Irish culture, identity and lifestyle from Englishness. And of course to also counter the many colonial legacies around anti-Irishness, anti-Irish stereotypes, the kind of sort of deep-rooted, perhaps inferiority complex which came out of the colonial experience. This nation-building project was aided by what have been called the imaginative assets generated by the late 19th century literary revival. And Brown has spoken about the heroic traditions, the mythological tales of the past, the heroes and the noble deeds of a vanished age. I love this quote, so I'm going to read it because I think it's just full of such powerful points. Brown writes that newly independent Ireland was endowed with a repository of myths, images and motifs, literary modes and conventions, cultivated to a degree that might indeed have been the envy of most emerging states in the century of infant fragile nationalism. So that point about Ireland kind of had this repository of myths and stories and legends which were cultivated to a degree that would have made other new nations envious. He refers to this as literary antiquarianism, which could be a powerful propaganda weapon because it helped to suggest a continuity of experience between the distant ancient past and this newly emerging partitioned nation. And so these are some of the points that I really want to pick up on in my presentation through the representations of Queen Tailté herself. So if we look at these kinds of ancient traditions and the iconography of the new nation, we can look to the work of writers like Lady Gregory, Yeats and Synge, and how they revived but reinvented the ancient Celtic folklore of brave warriors such as Cuchulainn. But of course, this iconography of the past was heavily gendered. The Tailteann Games illustrate how Irishness was defined and represented through Gaelic masculinity and idealized Irish womanhood. And this illustrates some of the tensions between the Celtic and Gaelic symbolism. The nationalist campaigns in many countries, not just in Ireland, but this is something that was going on elsewhere, were also underpinned by this kind of gendered ideology. Gender relations are crucial to understanding and analysing the phenomenon of nations and nationalism. There's been a whole body of research about the gendering of nationalist projects. In terms of gendering the nation, the images and the motifs and the symbols of Irish national iconography were female. We can think of all the female allegories that embodied national sacrifice and suffering. The image of the Sean Van Vocht, the poor old woman. National purity and integrity in the figure of Roisin Dubh, the dark Rosaleen. And national vulnerability in that image of Éireann or Hibernia. These are always suffering female characters. These female icons were evoked by poets, playwrights, politicians, and revolutionaries. These womanly symbols were portrayed as passive, silent, usually they hardly spoke at all, in opposition to the active strength, courage, heroism, and martyrdom of the men that they inspired. And we see this happening in other countries as well. It's important not to look at Ireland in glorious isolation. We see very similar patterns, for example, in India, where that kind of nationalist project also drew on female iconography, but in a way that marginalized and simplified the complexity of real women's experiences. And so we can see that nationalist rhetoric often privileges an imaginary woman over real women. And this is something we also see in the reporting and presentation of the Tailteann Games, as I'll discuss in a few minutes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in my work, I rely quite a lot on newspapers. And I think newspapers are vitally important, but they're perhaps an under-researched resource. So in the book that I'm currently working on with Eileen Hogan from UCC, we are looking at Ireland in the 1920s, but not through the lens of revolution, but through the lens of dancing and having fun and fashion, the flappers and jazz age of the 1920s, 100th anniversary of that as well. And we are also looking at newspapers, which are such a rich source of information about everyday life in Ireland at the time. Now, it's been argued that newspapers present the most commonplace and widely accessible of all gendered images and symbols of nation and nationhood. In addition to being widely available to the general public, newspapers, unlike, for example, the kind of well-used sources of novels, plays, and poetry, newspapers claim to be impartial and objective, so their representations of the nation carry that extra authenticity. In the early decades of independence, newspapers were the dominant form of media communication, and they played a key role in supporting, defining, and explaining the newly created nation to its readers. So basically, I'm saying we should all do more research on newspapers. And Goldring has indicated that the press formed part of a series of relays and transmissions that actively sought to contribute to the formation of an Irish national community and identity. Okay, so enough of the kind of background. Let's get on to the actual story itself. So on the 4th of August 1928, the Irish Independent gave lengthy coverage to the Éineacht Tailteann, which was heralded as the return of the Gael. And I would just like to emphasize that the newspapers of the period were full of the Éineacht Tailteann because it was very photogenic, and I'm going to show you lots of pictures in a minute. And so the newspapers had pages and pages of coverage and photographs from the Tailteann Games. So the Kerryman newspaper printed an article which was a reprint from the Irish-American newspaper, the National Hibernian. And it said, "The Tailteann Games are to Ireland what the Olympic Games were to ancient Greece." We've heard that already. "Nothing that the Irish people can do in a political way has rivaled what the Tailteann Games will do eventually to knit the nation into unity. Only among such people as the Irish could there have existed through more than 2,000 years the games and sports which are a symbol of a race." Now, this is so significant here because we see again that claim to 2,000 years of continuity, 2,000 years of uninterrupted history. But that this is the symbol of a race, so this real racialization of the Irish, the Gael as a race. A race, of course, that didn't just exist in Ireland, but in the diaspora around the world. And very much echoing the notion of return, the return of the Gael. The word return has a double meaning. It means return in that people are coming back to Ireland from America and overseas, but also the return of this ancient tradition, the revitalization, the rejuvenation of this ancient tradition. And I particularly think this quote is very powerful because the article talked about the Games had risen from the past to be a beacon for the future. And so we see this continuity from the past to the present, but to the future, this long stretch, unbroken over time. And as we've heard earlier on in the first presentation, the historical accuracy of all of that, of course, is questionable, to say the least. So enter the Queen. Here she is in all her glory, Queen Tailté. The press celebrated the symbolism of the festival. We were told that it was named after the ancient Celtic queen, Tailté, and her image was strongly associated with the revival. When you look at the newspaper coverage, her picture is on every page because she was so photogenic, so eye-catching, so stunningly beautiful. The papers carried many, many photographs of the actress Nancy Rock, who portrayed the part of Queen Tailté in the pageant that marked the opening ceremony in 24, 28, and 32. So Nancy had a good long stint there playing Queen Tailté. So on the 4th of August 1928, The Independent carried a photograph of Nancy Rock dressed in traditional Celtic clothing. She was wearing a long dress and a cloak tied with a large Celtic brooch. Her hair was plaited into 2 long braids reaching down to her waist. You can see them there in the picture. And she was adorned in bangles and other jewellery rich in Celtic symbolism. So she really was the embodiment of that Celtic past, that rich history. Now, on the 12th of August 1924, so this was the first staging of the Games, the Irish Independent carried a photograph of Miss Rock as she was about to portray Queen Tailté for the first time. And this was a play that kind of kicked off the Games, and this was a play held at the Theatre Royal here in Dublin. On the following day, the 13th of August, the Irish Times published a review of the production under the heading, Queen Tailté, a Vision Play. Written by Major Lawler of the National Army. I mean, I don't know how many majors in the army were writing plays, but that speaks volumes, I think. The play was based on a reconstruction of the life of Tailté, a reconstruction of the life of Tailté, it's worth repeating that, shown through a series of tableaux. Between each tableau, a Shanachie narrated the story of Tailté, her husband, Ucky, last of the Firbolg kings of Ireland, and her stepson, Lugh Lá Bhada. Miss Rock looked every inch the Queen. The play was directed by her mother, Mrs. Rock, and most of the participants. Were members of the Rock School of Dance and Drama. Now, some of the older members of the audience might be thinking of a certain famous Irish singer from the 70s and 80s who also had the name Rock, but I don't think that was his real name, so I don't think he's a relative. Now, I have to say, just harping back to the book I'm working on at the moment on the jazz age in Ireland in the 20s, Mrs. Rock's School of Dance and Drama figures quite prominently, so I think it was a very well known and very much on the cultural scene in Ireland at the time. So here's another picture from 1928 with the most interesting pair of earrings that you'll probably ever see in your life. The Irish Times described the event under the headline, Tailteann Games opening ceremony at Croke Park, 20,000 present. The most appealing note was struck by the tableau of Queen Tailté, attended by chieftains and maids. Miss Nancy Rock was an impressive figure in the part of Tailté. And then there's this close-up picture of her wearing these really huge earrings. The Independent carried similar photographs of the procession and the pageantry. Included amongst the photographs was a large picture of a procession of men and women wearing traditional ancient Irish costumes. In the foreground, I'll show you the picture in a minute, were 2 rows of women walking across a packed arena, all dressed like Queen Tailté with the long braids, and they carried tall spears which towered above their heads. The men were in the background wearing short tunics and carrying shields and spears. And here is the photograph. I hope you can make it out. I do think that the women's costumes were perhaps more flattering than some of the get-up that the men ended up wearing. Hints of a flapper. Now, it's not just that I'm currently obsessed with flappers, but I had made these points about Queen Tailté before, so it's not just a recent observation. So there was a separate picture, again, of Nancy Rock playing Queen Tailté, after whom the games are called. This time she was standing, again dressed in traditional Celtic clothes, with the ubiquitous Irish wolfhound, and the Irish wolfhound featured prominently in photographs in the newspapers around the games. It is noteworthy, however, I don't know how well you can see it in this picture, and this is from the front cover of my aforementioned book, is that she is wearing a very fashionable pair of 1920s high-heeled shoes. And I think that speaks volumes as well, because that really shows how what we see here is an image of ancient Irish clothing filtered through the lens of the 1920s. If you look at her headgear, I've seen a lot of pictures of kind of silent movie stars from Hollywood in the 1920s, and the headgear, the whole look, is not too dissimilar from this. So we can see that the representation, the imagery of what was considered beautiful and fashionable was very much influenced by the modern fashions of the 1920s. Okay, she's not wearing a short dress, but other than that, the drop waist, the headgear, the high-heeled shoes, it really does smack of the 1920s. And so for me, this really embodies some of the jarring contradictions about Queen Tailté and the iconography around her, that kind of meeting of modernity and tradition. Now, there were other discussions about her history and her pedigree. In an article that was published in the Sligo Champion, they added a bit more detail. This is from 1928, and they said the Éannacht Tailteann was instituted by Lú Lá Fada, a prince of the Tuatha Dé Danann. The festival was a commemoration of Queen Tailté, a Spanish lady, wife of Ucky, king of the Fir Bolg. Now, in a later article published in the Irish press, McCall repeats the story that she was the daughter now of a Spanish king, so now she's a Spanish princess. But this suggests that the notion that Tailté was from abroad, from across the sea, a foreigner, was actually an indication that she was otherworldly, not of this world, not necessarily Spanish, but certainly otherworldly. So the paper article from June 2032 went on to say, Tailté, or Talu, was no mortal, but a goddess, whose known attributes clearly indicate that she was the patroness of agriculture, in other words, a goddess of fertility. Lugh, her supposed foster son, was even more certainly the old Irish sun god whose long arms were to be seen in the sun's rays. McCall goes on to make the argument that the festival, which traditionally took place in August, of course famously Lunasa, was a kind of harvest festival. The first ripening was symbolized as the meeting of a sun god and the fertility goddess. So the meeting of a stepson and his mother. This is where it starts to get very weird, actually quite Greek in many ways. Clearly, Tailté was a highly complex and ambiguous figure. On the one hand, her previous incarnation as a sexualized goddess of fertility might well suggest that she was a somewhat unsuitable icon for good Catholic Ireland. But on the other hand, the success with which she was reconstructed as a safe, motherly symbol suggests a very deliberate, self-conscious process of nationalist reappropriation and reinvention of the past. This reinvention was framed by the ambiguity of Celticism versus Gaelicization of Irish society. The Celtic-Gaelic dichotomy was represented as a conflict not only in terms of language, but also religion, and in terms of particular readings of Ireland's past and Ireland's future. This is really apparent in the varied female symbols, the strong Celtic warriors, figures like Maeve, versus the passive, suffering Gaelic figures like the Sean Van Vogt. This idealization of asexualized motherhood, reflecting, of course, obviously in the Virgin Mother, We see this again with Tailté, where she becomes the stepmother or the foster mother rather than a real mother, which is somewhat ironic given that she was a fertility goddess. And so we see her now being reconstructed as the mother of the Gael. The Independent carried an article entitled, "In the Name of an Irish Queen, Tailté takes her children to her bosom, all glories revived." This is from 1928. "The sons of the scattered Gael have come home again. They have crossed the 7 seas at the bidding of the land from which their sires have sprung. They have come in the name of an Irish queen, and today, mid the regal splendour of far-off days, the pristine glory of a golden age, she will clasp them to her bosom in joyful, loving welcome." And so what we see very much in the press is this representation of the male athlete, the male Gael, this virile race of manhood. An article in the Irish press, for example, from 1932, showed photographs of 11 sporting heroes, all male, who were going to participate in the Games, including boxers, hurlers, Irish-born and of Irish descent. The lengthy article went on to describe how the Games were important in terms of moral fibre, chivalry, and manhood. The Games were not only a display of national distinctiveness, but celebrated the traditions of a virile race. The fact that scores of women were actually competing, not just in games like camogie and in swimming competitions, but also in cultural events, was not mentioned at all in the article. So many of these articles really focus the male as the competitor, the male, the Gael. The woman who received the most coverage was this mythical Queen Tailté. I just want to conclude by mentioning this one really kind of strange moment which occurred. And this was in the opening ceremony of 1932, when Eamon de Valera, who'd boycotted a previous revival, sat on the viewing stand with Cardinal MacRory, leader of the Catholic Church in Ireland. And this led to what I would consider to be an interesting but unspoken anomaly. And I'll just read this quote to finish from the Irish Times. "The crowd beheld a young man clad in skin garments leading a large Irish wolfhound. Mass bands of Irish pipers with the Black Raven standard at their head led the members of Tailté's court into the arena. The glory that was Ireland, a young giant with sun-tanned limbs, Lugh Lawfather, preceded them. All the splendour of their court robes were revealed as Queen Tailté, her handmaidens, druids and warriors extended their right arm to salute Cardinal MacRory." Now, this image of Celtic pagan royalty saluting the head of the Catholic Church in Ireland, I think, does carry a certain irony. And there is Queen Tailté herself raising her arm to salute the head of the Catholic Church. So I think what we see here is that while the Gaelic man was to test his manhood on the sports field, woman, as depicted by Queen Tailté, was constructed as a loyal wife and mother, or in the case of Tailté, this fertility goddess, reconfigured as the stepmother to Lugh Lawfather. Thank you very much.